Chanskona.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's a great pleasure to be back in the chamber and speaking to an NDP motion. There's no question, you don't have to go far or talk to many people to realize just what a challenging time it is for so many Canadians for so many reasons. I think one of the things that compounds that sense of frustration and anxiety and fear that people are feeling as their household budgets tighten are the contradictory messages that they're hearing about why that's happening and what can be done about it. If you listen to the government some days, when it suits their purposes, they'll tell you that the economy is doing great, that it's rebounded, that we're past the problems of COVID, that we've got excellent job numbers and good growth, and that the money's flowing in and things are good. Other times they give a bit more of a realistic assessment if they're in excuse-making mode. But it is hard, I think, for Canadians who are struggling so much in their household and at the grocery store, as our leader was just saying, putting things back on their shelf that their kids are excited to eat or that are a normal part of their family cook night. It's frustrating to hear that things are going well, that things are back to normal, because that's certainly not the experience that people are living at the pump and at the grocery store and around their kitchen tables. And so I think it's incumbent upon us as public policy makers to try and find a path through those contradictory messages to something concrete that can be done. Because for sure, there's a lot going on in the world right now, no question, whether it's the continuing economic fallout of COVID and what that means for supply chains and what climate change means for supply chains and is going to continue to mean for supply chains going into the future. There's what's happening in Ukraine right now, which of course has dramatically increased the price of gas at the pumps. There's all sorts of things that are happening that are hard to control, not just for individual Canadians, to be sure, but even for governments. That makes it that much more important that governments act on the things they can do something about. And an important part of the story that we don't hear enough of, we heard a little bit of it from the Parliamentary Budget Officer at the end of last year, and part of the reason why Canadians can be living such a difficult financial experience at home and in the personal experience of their families and their loved ones and their friends and their neighbors in the midst of this apparently good economic news lies in the fact that more and more of the wealth that's being created is going into fewer and fewer hands. So if you're just talking about the economy in general, if you're talking about GDP, if you're talking about how much money is being produced in the Canadian economy, if you're talking about the value of the exports that are leaving Canada, then you can hear good news. And that's why in corporate boardrooms and in the boardrooms of banks, they're celebrating, because they hear that good news and they don't feel the pinch because they're part of that 1% that is getting not only a good chunk of that, but a bigger and bigger proportional piece of that pie. So as the pie grows, not only is their piece increasing relative to the size of the pie, but the amount of the pie they get is also increasing. And that's why we can hear about good news for the economy and big economic growth and all these things that normally Canadians would expect to mean that life would be a little bit better for them in the midst of so many stories of hardship. People worried about losing their home, and in fact, more people than ever losing their home. Homelessness is going up in Canada since the pandemic. The cost of housing is getting ridiculous. It was already ridiculous and growing astronomically before the pandemic, and it's only gotten worse. Housing prices almost doubling, I think, in the last 2 years. And I apologize if I don't have that stat exactly right, but the fact that that number is even what would occur to someone who's been hearing these numbers day in, day out as likely close to the number is a sign of how bad things have got. So I wanted to put some of those thoughts on the record to help Canadians who might be listening understand how we can be presented with apparent good economic news again and again by the government and by certain economists and by large corporations in their presentations to shareholders, and yet feel so helpless in the face of very difficult economic circumstances. And I said earlier, and I'll repeat again, Madam Speaker, it makes it all the more important that because some of the things driving inflation are outside the control of government, the government zero in on the things that it can do something about. And wealth inequality is something that governments can do something about. It's something that governments at one time in the post-war period did something about. And over the last 30 or 40 years, we've seen successive liberal and conservative governments. See how easy it is to just kind of flip those things around in your mouth, Madam Speaker, I'll tell you. Anyway, successive liberal and conservative governments have been undoing the good work that was done in the post-war period to make sure, in a time of a sense of strong social bond, when people went to fight for freedom and for prosperity and felt that they were owed a good life when they came back, and that their families who sacrificed while they were away fighting and who worked in factories producing munitions and supported the war effort in other ways were owed a good life when they came back. What did that mean? That meant ensuring that a small number of people at the top didn't get to run away with all the wealth while everyone else suffered. And that system that was built when there was that strong sense of social solidarity has been undermined now for a very long time. And it's about time, Madam Speaker, that if we're going to do anything about the very real pinch that Canadians are feeling now, that we tackle this problem of wealth inequality. Now, the Liberals have made promises to that effect, various kinds over the years, but they haven't acted on them in the way that they need to if they're really going to fix the problem. And one of their most recent promises was to have a surtax on banks who made extraordinary profits during the pandemic. Not their normal extraordinary profits, but additional profits on top of their normal extraordinary profits. And so asking them to pay a little bit more on that additional extraordinary profit is not at all unreasonable. In fact, I think it's something we are morally required to do, and that we have so far failed in our duty to do that, Madam Speaker. And we've seen the crisis in Ukraine has shown that the lack of financial transparency both in Canada and across the world is not benign. And it's not even just about missing out on the opportunity to invest that extraordinary profit that we might tax a portion back into programs, as we should, like dental care, like pharmacare, like supporting good public education. All of these things that we need to do, and I could go on with that list, Madam Speaker, but I only have so much time, so I won't. We've also seen the way that actors on the international stage who control this amount of wealth benefit and are able to support people like Vladimir Putin by hiding his wealth around the world. And that's how the concentration of wealth and power can become very malignant indeed. And we shouldn't wait until a dictator feels so empowered and emboldened, not just by what's going on in his own country, but what's going on in the international world of finance, that he can go ahead and do what Putin has done in Ukraine and still feel confident that he's going to be able to enjoy his yachts and his palaces, and that his buddies are going to continue to travel the world with impunity. That's where the question of wealth inequality and what's going on in the Ukraine and in other parts of the world come to get mixed together, and I think and show why it's important on an ongoing basis to make sure that we're not encouraging the massive concentration of wealth in the hands of a very few people at the top. It's why I'm proud that not only are we proposing what the Liberals proposed in the last election with a surtax on the profits of banks, we're proposing it be expanded to other big winners of the corporate winners of the pandemic, like big box stores and oil and gas companies that are now raking it in with prices that are really high at the pump. But we've also included the demand for a public beneficial ownership registry, because that is what we need on two fronts. We need it to take on the likes of Vladimir Putin and his oligarch cronies who are hiding his wealth across the world. And we also need a public beneficial ownership registry in order to be able to properly record the wealth of the top 1% so that they can be taxed to pay a fair share of the services that we need to provide so that all can benefit. And I think that's why this is such an important motion, and I'm looking forward to all members supporting it at the vote. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary. Thank you, Madam Speaker. You know, to address the issue of wealth inequity, something in which the NDP often will talk about, I've made reference to the issue of the 1% wealthiest being taxed as one of the first initiatives this government had taken. I've also, in the past, made reference to substantial increases to the GIS and government investments. You know, recently we have made announcements across Canada, a national child care program, billions of dollars. That is a distribution. I would ultimately argue a redistribution that is taking place. So there's different ways in which we can tackle this problem. One of the other ways, and maybe ask for his comments in regards to this issue, is there's a lot of people that avoid paying taxes. And over the last 5 years, we have invested literally close to $1 billion on going after those, because there's a lot of wealth that's there that's being avoided in taxes. And if he could provide his thoughts in terms of providing Revenue Canada the proper tools to ensure that we're collecting fair taxes.
Member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, I mean, he's certainly right that there are people who are avoiding paying their fair share, and it's something that we've long said here in the NDP that we want to see government make a priority. I think one of our frustrations is that the kind of talking points aside, Canada stands alone in respect to the Panama Papers and the Paradise Papers of not actually having successfully prosecuted anyone, not a one. So, you know, I hear what he's saying. Yeah, that sounds great. What we're looking for is a government that's actually going to make it happen. So if they're sincere in actually wanting to do the things the member says that they want to do in tackling tax avoidance, yikes, because they sure as hell don't know how to get it done, Madam Speaker. And I dare say they're not sincere because, of course, we can't call anyone a liar in this House. I wouldn't dream of doing it. But something's not working because we have a government that, given the day, is professing to want to take on tax avoidance and tax evasion, and yet over 6 years in, it hasn't happened. So where's the missing link, Madam Speaker? That's what we're trying to figure out on this side of the House.
Questions et commentaires. Questions and comments, honorable député.
The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I listened closely to what my colleague had to say. And there is something that I understand. When there are various ways to address a situation, for example, inflation or an increase in vulnerability, well, actually, we see some parties here in the House that have a lot of proposals, and yet there aren't many days left until this government will be putting forward another budget. We've heard a lot of proposals. We've heard about the 3% proposals. We've heard about what should be done to do something about the lack of new housing starts. Does my colleague agree with me that it is very important that this government listen to and consider each proposal? And in the same line of thought, why is it that this government almost always votes against? The Honourable Member for Elmwood-Transcona. Yes. I agree in that there are various ways to address this situation. What is beginning to alarm me is that this government, which has various paths that it could take, will not choose any one of those paths. Instead, we will remain in the status quo. And in fact, worse than that, the status quo is actually a trend. So it's not actually going to stay stable. It's a trend towards concentrating money and power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. We need to do something to reverse that trend. We need to change the status quo. And so if it's not this proposal, but I think this is a good proposal, but if it's not this, it needs to be something else. But this government has not shown that it has its own plans in this regard. This government does not seem ready to consider other parties' plans either, but it is imperative that we adopt a plan. Not only for the next year, but for 10, 15, 20 years in the future. We are at a time when we have the opportunity we have the opportunity to lay the foundations of an economy that could be truly equitable. But we need to take the initiative now.
Debate, the